Go. Recording. Thank you so much for being here tonight, everyone. As more people come, I had a great response for it, but then again, this is life and things come up. So that's one reason why we record, so that when they ask for me for the recording later, I can give it to them and they can still benefit from this amazing information that Nathan is going to share with us tonight. So before I turn it over to Nathan, I would like for everyone to please keep your cameras on. Allie, I know you're not. One reason why I always ask for you guys to keep your cameras on or turn them on is because this is an open Zoom link, and I do not want predators or people that shouldn't be on this call with us. I don't want them on this call. So if they don't have their camera on, I don't know who they are, right? But I know Allie. So Allie, if you need your camera off, that's fine. But the rest of you, if you could keep them on so that Nathan can judge if you're zoning out, or if he needs to change something that he's talking about. He won't know how to interact with you guys if he can't see your faces. That's another reason to keep our cameras on, and to keep yourselves muted, because if you're like me, you might have dogs in the background that might start barking in the middle of his presentation, and we don't want to distract anybody or our presenter. So unless you have a question or he asks a question, if you can keep yourself muted, you can drop questions in the chat. Of course, that will either go to everybody or just to me. So depending on what you want, I'm sure Nathan will have a question and answer time, or maybe he'll let you ask during it. He'll let you know. But he shook his head yes for question and answer time. So without further ado, I would love to introduce Nathan. Thank you so much for being here. Nathan, I greatly appreciate you and your time and what you're going to share with us tonight. And you could just briefly introduce yourself and run with it. And I'm going to mute myself so that my dogs don't start barking. Thank you again.
Awesome. No, thank you, Sandy, for having me. Oh, I'm so grateful here to be in front of you guys. I've been looking forward to this all week. And let me see here, guys. You all are probably way much better at Zoom than I am, like, because you have to do this all the time. And so I'm going to share my screen here and get my presentation going. Yeah, you think I would get used to it after the year and a half that we've had to deal with this, but yeah, Sandy invited me over here to talk about grief. I've already talked to adults about this topic. And some of your parents maybe will join that talk. As you can tell, like with you guys, like I was like, I looked at my PowerPoint before we got started, and I was like, gosh, like the ones I did for the adults was so boring. Like it was just simply black and white. So I was trying my best to make it like not as boring. I thought about labeling this talk "Good Grief." Then I thought that might be too corny, and so anyway, I labeled it "Making Sense: Why Misery and Grief is Optional." And I'll talk to you guys more about that title here in a minute. But as Sandy said, I would love to introduce myself. That is me. I am a professional counselor in Chattanooga. I've worked with kids, with teenagers, with adults. I've worked with a whole host of like mental health issues, with whether it's like related to grief or anxiety, depression. And grief is one of those ones I've really grown to really enjoy loving to work with, which I'll explain about later. I'm also a husband. I've been married for about 2.5 years, been with my wife for about 3 years. She's truly my best friend, like one of those relationships that makes life worth living. And together, me and her are cat parents. And as you can tell, I included like the only picture I have in this whole slide is of my cats, and which you may not care about that, but I included like our 2 cats. Ollie is a Siamese right there, and then you have Bagheera, the black cat. And you may eventually hear them in the background because they hear me talking, and they're going to want to come in here because they have to be around me. They are ridiculous cats, by the way. Ollie is a total diva, and Bagheera is just kind of like the clumsy one of the family. I've never met a clumsy cat before until I met Bagheera. Literally broke Christmas gifts before, and we've had to replace him because he's just kind of a chunkster. And then I'm also a horror movie fan. Love me some Stephen King. Love like anything like thriller, psychological. Love good books, coffee, all those sort of things. Like that's just kind of what makes me me. So when I'm not working, my dream day honestly is just being at the house, like either watching a good movie or reading a good book with a good cup of coffee. So let me get into it and like just talk about grief. Like what is grief? And so like Sandy said, like I did want to kind of open this up to you guys because I just didn't want this just to be a time where I'm talking to you guys and you're just sitting there like having to regurgitate or, taking all this information. I was kind of wanting to hear from you guys, like what you all think grief is before we even get started. And if anyone has an idea, like you can unmute yourself or you can just message in the chat bar, but I would love to kind of give a moment and just see like what you guys think that grief is or what comes to your mind when you think about grief. Maybe you think grief is bad, or maybe you think about grief being a problem, but I would love, yeah, just what your first impressions are when you think about grief. And I hear my cat in the distance scratching at the door wanting to get in. So if you hear that, that's what it is. And feel free to put your impressions, but while you're getting ready, if you're typing or if you want to unmute yourself, just let me know. If you raise your hand, you may, I can't tell. Oh, actually I see in the chat, there we go. You think I'd be good. Yeah, so Sandy, you said sadness. Ivy, you mentioned depressed, which is definitely part of grief. Does anyone else like have any words they think about when they think of grief? There's really truly no wrong answer because depression and sadness, guilt. Yeah, that's a huge one. Anyone else? Anyone think of anything else when they think of grief? Yeah, regret, emptiness. A lot of heavy emotions. So grief, let me tell you guys this story about grief. And if anyone else has any words, they can feel free to add as we move along. And I'll be sure to try to check them as we do. But let me tell you guys this story about grief. So growing up, when I was in the 6th grade, our family adopted this black cat named Shadow. I've always had a thing for like stereotypes and, some people don't take in black cats for some reason because they associate it with bad luck. But for whatever reason, I was a kid and I wanted a black cat. And my uncle randomly had this black cat that he gave to us. Her name was Shadow. She was fully grown when we took her in. And we had her in our family for about 15 or 16 years. And, during that time, she gave birth to 6 kittens. She like grew up with me and my sister. I mean, guys, it was crazy. Like she was such a hunter and such a ferocious cat. My sister as a toddler, she could like waddle around and she could grab a hold of that cat and like sling it back and forth. And that cat wouldn't even scratch it or like, hiss at it or anything. She wouldn't even bother her. And she was such a good cat. Well, one day I was in college, I was in school, I was studying, doing whatever. And I get a phone call from my mom. And she lets me know that Shadow had passed away. Now, I should preface this by telling you guys too that Shadow had this habit of whenever she saw our vehicle pulling into the driveway, she always had to like come down from the front porch and meet us at the door so we could let her in. And my mom, who swore that she would never let a cat stay in, she grew this soft spot in her heart that she would begin to let Shadow come in. So Shadow, when she passed away, my mom, we all felt it deeply because we had grown. I mean, Shadow was just part of our family, but my mom especially like felt it hard. And do you know, guys, like even after a year or 2 years, even after Shadow's passing, my mom would talk about how she would expect to see Shadow coming down the front porch when she would drive in. And I say this not to, make you guys feel sad or, even though we've talked about how grief is obviously associated with some heavy emotions, but to tell you that we can grieve anything. A lot of times people grieve like the loss of like a family member or they grieve like a death, but grief can look like a loss of a pet. It can look like the loss of a place. Actually, whenever my parents, they had their house for about 20 years, they recently moved about a couple of years ago. And do you guys know that, before they moved, my mom had to walk through each of the rooms and just let herself like cry and weep over each of the rooms and the memories that were associated with each place because she was letting herself grieve. And that's part of the beautiful part about being human is that we form relationships, we form these attachments, and we form these friendships with our people, with our classmates, with our teachers, with our spouses. but we also form it, in relation to like people that we haven't even met yet before. Some of you all may have like a favorite actor, or you all may have a favorite singer or rapper. Um, or you may have like a favorite movie character. Like I know I've got some Marvel fans out there who are listening right now, and I can tell you that when we watched Avengers Endgame, there was very rarely a dry eye in the place when, well, I won't spoil that, but if you haven't watched it by now, it's kind of late. But when Iron Man did what he did, and with that loss, like we as humans, we form these relationships, and with losses comes these emotions. And I also wanted guys to ask you all another question too, is what do you guys think of whenever you all think about grief in relation to COVID, like what we have been through this past year and a half or 2 years? And if you guys are comfortable, if you want to, I'd love for you all to share in the chat box, like maybe some of the losses that have been experienced either by yourself or you've seen friends experience in relation to COVID. So yeah, if you want to put that in the chat box, if you're comfortable, of course. Some people have lost loved ones to COVID. So that's a pretty obvious one. Some people have lost, experienced the loss of health. I'm thinking about you guys as my teams, as you guys or teams who I've worked with, some of the things that you all have lost. Yeah, many have lost freedom. Yeah, that's a really interesting word, Allie. Like many have lost freedom. Dogs, yeah. Allie, if you wanted to, I'd love if you wanted to comment even that more in the chat about like, freedom in association with what, like what type of freedom has been lost, or you can even pop up on here too if you want to talk. But I understand if you don't want to as well.
Well, I know personally for me, I haven't been able to do the things that I was like once able to do.
Mm,
It's kind of like isolates yourself or like makes you feel that you can't do like you can't do you wow, English.
you're fine.
um so for freedom can mean a
Mm,
bunch of different things, and like most people see freedom as like being able to like do what they want, and many people couldn't do what they want because of COVID.
yeah,
Couldn't be with friends, they couldn't be with family, they couldn't do a lot of things that they wanted to do that was normal in their life, and they had to just quit all that.
yeah. Allie, thank you for that too, because you're exactly right. While you were talking, Allie, I was thinking about how used to before COVID, there was a group of guys, we would all get together and we would go to the movie theaters on Tuesday nights, which was like $5 movies at AMC, and we would watch like these horror movies or whatever was coming out. And that wasn't available for us anymore after COVID for a year and a half. Like, I mean, that freedom, like just being able to go and meet someone. And so, yeah, I really resonated with what you were saying. Does anybody else have anything they would like to say as far as like a loss specific to COVID? I mean, think about it, guys, like a loss of normalcy, like Ali was saying, playing sports. Yeah, Blake, that's a good one. Playing sports like we used to. I've worked with some senior. Ooh, yeah, yeah, Sandy. Like, I've known people too who have passed away from COVID. Yeah, Ali, loss of jobs and income. Yeah, I mean, what a huge loss because a lot of people find their identity in their career, and when they've worked so long for it, um, that when that loss happened, it hit on multiple levels. Yeah, Ivy, instead of being able to breathe fresh air, having to wear masks, which, like we do, like as following like, CDC instructions to protect our neighbors. But you're right, like just being able to walk into a store without having to put on a mask. Like, I mean, talk about loss of normalcy. I was even thinking about some of my seniors I've worked with, like they actually had to grieve the loss of like important events like graduations, in person. They've had to grieve losses of like proms that they've looked for since high school. Blake not being able to see friends. Yeah. I mean, some of these like keystone memories. Yeah, there's been a separations happen this year and hating, like that grief being felt. All these are really good answers. And and here's the thing too, like I'm so appreciative of Sandy putting on this workshop for you guys, because I think sometimes, well, I think there's so much more awareness coming up about mental health now, more than there's, ever been. And I think in many ways it's being destigmatized. Like, I used to joke, like, you can't really go into a coffee shop without hearing someone talk about their therapist, and I think in many ways it's beautiful. But as teens, like, you guys have experienced grief just like the rest of us, if not more so. My heart goes out to you guys. I was telling someone this today. I've not had to grow up in a world where I had to like bounce between virtual and in person and learn how to navigate that. I mean, there's a lot of pressure on being teens already. I mean, you have the social pressures, you have pressures about your grades, you have people who are asking you what you want to do with your life. I mean, you have all this sort of stuff you're trying to navigate on top of a pandemic. I see, that's a beautiful one, seeing family from out of town. Like, I know some of you guys probably couldn't see your grandparents for a while in person, and what a loss that is. Or cousins or extended family. Yeah, guys, these are all great answers. These are all really good. And so when we think about grief, a lot of times we think about, I'm going to keep the chat bar up in case anyone else has anything that you want to add to it while we're talking, because these are beautiful answers. But when we think about grief, like, a lot of times people are quick to associate it with death, which is definitely a type of grief. But there is a type of grief, and then there's a non-death type of grief. And grief is I'm getting ahead of myself, but it's very nuanced, as you will see here. Let me actually go ahead to my next slide really quickly and pull up the chat bar here. So grief is natural. It's a natural reaction to a perceived loss. So I tell everyone to grieve is to be human. One of the leading experts of grief, his name is David Kessler. He says that grief is a reflection of a lost connection. And so, as I was saying about, like, us as humans, that we form these connections, we form these attachments. Whenever we experience a loss, grief is our natural reaction to that. And grief is unique. I went all bold there because I can't emphasize that enough. Because, like, how I'm going to grieve is going to look different than how Sandy grieves, or how Allie grieves, or Ivy or Blake. We all grieve differently. People, we do these things where we say, like, grief has to look like crying, or we expect and tears are definitely appropriate and so beautiful. But sometimes people grieve without crying. Some people grieve through anger, or they experience depression, like we were talking about. But grief it's unique. I mean, honestly, I've heard it like compared to, like, grief is as unique as our fingerprints, and even when we look as, like, our fingerprints, like, no one of our fingerprints are alike, and none of ours are alike either. And so grief is incredibly unique. It's unpredictable. Some people have described grief as being a roller coaster, or a hurricane, or a tornado, where it's hard to predict. Sometimes people call it coming in waves, like they feel like things are going well for a while, but then, like, anniversaries come up. Or, guys, let me tell you this specific to COVID. Something I have noticed, I'm working with as a counselor when I'm working with my teenagers, is this past summer we saw a decrease, at least here in Tennessee and Hamilton County where I practice. We had such a decrease in numbers, and there was such, like, a relief almost that was being felt this summer among my clients. But then the numbers, when they begin to rise again, like, I can't tell you how many times I heard, "Oh no, not this again," and then people begin to feel all that coming back up again. And grief is not limited to time. There was once a study, I can't quote you who did the study, which is kind of saying more. I'm not a researcher, I'm a therapist, but I do try to do a little bit of research. And I once heard a study that was quoted where people asked, like, how long do you think is the appropriate amount of time to grieve a loss? And the average number, I don't know if you, well, let me throw this back out to you guys. Y'all have any guesses, like, as far as, like, the average number, like what people said as far as, like, time to grieve a loss? Anyone have any guesses they want to throw out? 7 days? Sandy said 1 year. Sandy, me and you are drawn from the DSM. And then, because that's what the DSM says. Last I checked anyway. Allie, 5 years. That's a good one. That's a long one. So, Blake, you are actually the closest to what that study said. The average number of people, that what they said was that to the average time was 2 weeks, was what people came back and said. 2 weeks to grieve a loss. And I couldn't help but thinking, like, have these people never experienced grief before? Because grief is not limited to time. It can last for it can be, it changes how it looks over time. And I had a professor one time who lost his sister, and he talked about his grief felt about her. And he said, I've learned that and this has stuck with me since I've been in practicing. He said, the grief for me has never gone away, but it has changed how it's looked over time. And one thing that's important to know about grief is, like, our grief often feels more intense the closer the relationship that we have to something. Like, my mom, she grieved the loss of our house because she had she'd seen me and my sister grow up there 20 plus years in that house. When I moved from my apartment, like, my very first apartment I had, like, I was like, oh, like, it was sad, it was bittersweet, but it wasn't like intense because I didn't have like the richness of the experience that I had with our family home that we had growing up. Let me quickly just say, grief is not a disease or a pathology. It's not a problem, and it's not a quick fix. That's one thing, like, I think with grief that a lot of times people are quick to do. Like, they're and this kind of comes from people's, like, uncomfortability, where they're quick to be like, well, that person's in a better place, or at least this isn't happening. But they want to treat grief as if it's a problem. But in reality, like, grief is just such an it's just such it's all about sorry, I lost my train of thought. I saw Sandy comment, and then I'm so, like, tunnel focused. And so my apologies. I do want to read Sandy's comment. Yeah, the amount of time that society thinks we should grieve makes so much sense why so much guilt is wrapped around grief. Exactly, Sandy. No, you hit the nail on the head. Like, I think a lot of times there's a lot of expectations that society or that people put on us to grieve. A lot of times people will talk about how, like, after a funeral, that things, it seems like things go back to normal, or things, or sorry, after a funeral, people are really good. Like, they're bringing the food, they're bringing the casseroles. Like, I grew up Southern Baptist, and so, like, people would bring fried chicken, all these, it was people would come together as a community. But then, like, it's like the months and the normalcy sets in. It's not that grief goes away, but oftentimes I think a lot of people feel pressure that they shouldn't feel like they're not allowed to feel this sadness or this depression or whatever feeling, because they're thinking, like, it's been this much time, I shouldn't be feeling this way. And guys, believe it or not, I have worked with clients who are in their 70s who have actually allowed themselves to grieve losses they experienced in childhood because they didn't have the opportunity or the means to, as a child, to grieve. And so grief doesn't really go away. And grief, it only becomes complicated when we don't allow ourselves to feel our feelings, when we try to suppress our emotions. But I'll get more into that in a minute. But grief, ultimately, if you get anything out of this presentation, grief is part of being human. It's not a problem or a disease. Let me see here. So let me tell you guys what grief can look like. And I want y'all's opinion, be thinking about this too, of, like, how you all have seen grief play out. I've only put, like, a few symptoms of kind of what I have seen come through my office, but I do want to hear from your perspective, like, also, like, ways in which you think grief can interfere with people, or how or what it can look like. First, grief can look like difficulty sleeping. Some people, whenever they go to bed at night, like, I'm a pretty easy sleeper. Like, I'm easy to turn off my brain just like that. I have some clients whose brains are just so beautifully wired that they're always thinking. And a lot of times when people experience grief, sometimes that's when the grief hits them, is at night when they're trying to sleep, and it gets in the way of their sleeping. Some people report that food tastes differently or weird. They might have, like, a favorite meal that this loved one used to cook for them. Or, Allie, going back to what you were saying earlier, like, some of us had these favorite restaurants that we used to go to. And then as a result of the pandemic, they may have closed down, or, it's just like, it doesn't feel like we're able to, like, enjoy it like we used to because of grief. Grief can get in the way with memory. It can cause difficulty with memory. that grief can interfere with memory when someone is experiencing their grief, and sometimes that comes along the ways, like sometimes people, when they've experienced their loss, they'll go for a time and they'll begin to forget like what their loved one sounded like, their voice, or what they smelled like, and that actually provokes some anxiety within them, which gets to my next symptom. Like a lot of times grief can look like anxiety. Some of my like thinkers, like when they're going through these things, grief is sometimes anxiety can get balled up in grief, because like when these thoughts come in, and what happens is when people experience a loss, for some people it can be very traumatic for them, and so they begin to feel nervous about, well, what if this person passes away, what if this happens, like what if, and or you guys, let me tell you all something else that that we didn't talk about as far as grief. And this may sound silly, but I have seen people who have grieved relationships that they have been in, like romantic relationships, like their first girlfriend or first boyfriend. And then actually when that breakup happens, it hits them hard because they're grieving that loss. And some of my people come in and they're like, I'm never going to date again. I don't want to get in a relationship again. So sometimes grief can look like anxiety, or especially in this context, it can look like anger. Like I've seen some of my sweetest, like, kids, our teenagers will come in. For the past months, we've been talking about how wonderful this relationship is. And all of a sudden, one session they come in and they're like, oh, that was the worst ever. I can't believe that they did that. Like, it's part of their anger, their feeling. And you guys are teens, you all know your language. Sometimes they've used language I'm not going to say in a professional setting, but I'll let them say in my therapeutic setting, because that's part of their anger and letting them feel their emotions. I've also had people who have felt anger as far as like being abandoned, and it feels like when they've lost someone, like there's a sense of abandonment. Depression, I think Ivy or someone, or Blake or someone else said too, or Sandy, you said that grief can often look like depression. It can look like shame, which is what we were talking about earlier with Sandy. Like, that sometimes that can come out with our society, that people feel like they don't feel like they have permission to feel their grief. And then it can look like difficulty with school or homework or things around the house. The thing about it is, guys, we all have like a certain mental capacity in which we function, and we have a certain amount of mental energy that we have each day. And when you have so much mental capacity that's like attending to your grief, to your emotions, it makes sense that you're not going to be able to concentrate in school on what your teacher's saying. It makes sense that, it's going to be harder to like concentrate around the house, because you're truly feeling what you're going through, and that mental energy is being wrapped up in the grief, which I think a lot of times can lead into shame, because people be like, well, I'm not, they feel embarrassed for not operating the way that they were prior to the grief. But that's actually a very normal symptom of grief, is when people like have difficulty operating at the function that they used to. So let me check here the chat bar and see, oops, sorry. Let me go back, whoops. Let me go to the chat bar and see if anyone included any other symptoms. Yeah, Allie, that's a good one. It can affect people by making them seem overly happy, to not let anyone see them hurting. Oh my gosh. Like, Allie, you are so insightful. Like, these are really good. You all are so insightful. These are good comments. But you're right. Like, sometimes I have clients who come into my office and it's just like, they just kind of like let themselves like actually, it's like they feel like they let themselves be seen. They're like, no one knows I'm going through this. Like, no one else knows. Like, because a lot of times people, and I don't know what y'all's experience has been, but some of my clients have told me that they feel like if they were to have like, let people in, if they were to like not be okay, that it might worry other people, or or it's like their pain might be a burden to other people. So yes, Sally, that's a good one. Feel free, guys, to add any more symptoms that you may think of. I'm going to go on to the next slide. So grief is a natural part, like I said, natural part of being human. It's part, and like I said, it comes in waves, and it can be provoked by the time, accordance to time, like the way people grieve after a week after a loss, or a month or a loss, might look different than how they're grieving a year afterwards. Or it might be provoked by like anniversaries, or holidays can be a really big provoking of grief. So please take everything I put. These are some things I have found that people, that in my research and like in my work, that people have said that has been helpful when it feels like the grief wave hits. First off, breathe. Breathe is, and I know it might sound simple, and like I love when I get my clients who experience anxiety when they come into the office and they're like, everyone just tells me to breathe, but it's not working. And so I put that in there though with grief. Like, I think a lot of times it's just value in breathing in and just letting yourself feel that breath as it comes into the moment, and just kind of reorienting yourself to the moment, because a lot of times grief can feel like very just confusing. Some people describe it like being in a brain fog, or they feel like it's like a haze, or they're in a dream. And so sometimes just simply breathing and allowing yourself to be present in your environment, it can be so powerful. I put moving, exercising. Grief, there's a lot of research coming out now that talks about how our emotions are stored in our bodies. I'll tell you guys this quick story that one time I was a college student and I went to the dentist, and I was complaining to the dentist about how my jaw was hurting so bad. Like, even so much, it was like it would pop every time I would yawn. And she said, well, you're a college student. You probably walk around stressed all the time and you're clenching your teeth. And sure enough, like, she was right. Wasn't a psychologist, just a very insightful dentist who knew to ask the right question. But people feel that grief in their bodies too. Like, you can honestly see, like, if you've ever been to a funeral, you might see like some people's like shoulders hunched. Like, grief feels heavy. Even as we're having this conversation, you guys may even notice yourself feeling like your own heaviness as you're thinking about grief. And so I encourage people too to like find ways to move or to exercise, just to keep your body moving, to work some of that energy out, whether it's through yoga or going through a walk. It doesn't have to be like, lifting weights or anything, even though that might be your preferred method of exercise. Find ways to get your body moved and being kind to your body. I put out here, call or text a friend. And Allie, I think this really hits to what you were saying as far as like, trying to put on like a happy face. There are times where we just need other people. And that doesn't mean that, you have to like actually talk about your grief with another person, but just simply to let another person be near you so you don't feel alone. Or just to simply text a friend and have that conversation with them. Write it out. Sometimes, and I'm gonna put write it out and be creative together, because I think they go hand in hand. Sometimes grief or any of our other like overwhelming emotions, sometimes it feels like we can't put words to what we're feeling. Like, I don't know if you've all ever been to that experience, but it's like you don't exactly know what you're feeling. You know that you're feeling something, but you just can't put words. Like, what you're feeling actually feels unspeakable. And that's actually pretty normal, because grief, it can be traumatic. And like I said, and sometimes when things like this happen, like stress or traumas happen, the right side of our brain, which is kind of like more of like our emotional side of our brain, like think of like your artistic or your creative side of the brain, it really feels it. But the left side of the brain, which is, when I think of the left side of the brain, like I think of left for L's, and I think of the 3 L's, which is language, linear thinking, and I always forget the third L, logic. Maybe because I don't have a lot of logic sometimes, but logic, linear thinking, and language. Those are primarily like functions of your left side of your brain. And sometimes like your right side of the brain and your left side of the brain have a difficulty in communicating with each other. And it feels like it's like really hard to access and put words on what you're feeling. So I honestly, in many of my sessions, I encourage my clients to utilize art, or to share with me the music that they're listening to, or to be able, like I said, to write it out. Give yourself permission to feel your feelings, which I think is like kind of been a thing that we've been hitting on. If you feel a lot of times, like, well, someone said anger earlier, and when I was thinking about like this little bullet point right here, a lot of times people feel like they don't have permission to feel angry, because a lot of times, like, I grew up all the time like, Nathan, you shouldn't be angry about that, don't let that bother. Like, sometimes we just get communicated that message that anger is not okay to feel, when actually anger is a perfectly normal response to grief. It's allowing yourself to give yourself permission to feel your feelings. It doesn't mean that you're an angry person or that you're even a depressed person, but that you're just allowing yourself to be human and to feel your emotions. And this goes right into the next bullet point, which is being kind to yourself. And then, I talked about shame, about how a lot of people can say like, well, I shouldn't be feeling this, or, I'm less of a person, or I'm weak. but being kind, like actually like extending like kindness to yourself. Like Brene Brown, who is kind of one of my heroes, she says that we should all be in the practice of talking to ourselves like we talk to someone that we love. And then asking for help, which I'll hit on that here in a minute because I kind of dedicated its own slide for that. But I want to jump down to the next bullet point, which is taking time to celebrate what is going well. You know, and why I put that is like, I'm not one of those people who's like, oh, look for the silver lining in the crowds or be positive, because there's just a time where you don't have to feel positive, and that's okay. But there be some times where I tell people laughter is good for grief. And some of like the funerals and some of the places I've been, like, you know, some of my favorite memories have been talking about these stories and like laughing. And so actually, when we still talk about Shadow, we talk about this really funny story that she did. She had these cats, and we let some of them be adopted, but we kept some of them as well. And she was a black cat, and then her son, he was also a black cat, so we called him Copy, like a copycat. And Copy one day, Shadow got so territorial, and she was such a sweet cat. But one day, like, she walked over to Copy and she began licking him. And you know, as a cat, they groom each other, and he would loved it. Oh my gosh, like he was eating it up. And all of a sudden, she took her two paws and she like took his face and like went "Bah, bah, 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 bah." And like, oh my gosh, we died laughing because it was so funny, and we still talk about that to this day. And so I say that, and it's like, it's okay to laugh. Like laughing does not dishonor your loss. It's okay to feel positive emotions. Sometimes like we feel like we shouldn't feel that way. But just like, you know, to give ourselves to feel permission to feel anger or depression, we also have permission to feel happiness or laughter too. Those emotions that make us feel good. And then I think I didn't put this bullet point down, but I would say kind of summing this all up, I always find a way when I'm working with my clients about grief is finding ways to help them feel like they're honoring their loss, whether it be for a loved one or whether it be for a place, but finding a way to like kind of almost in a sense like memorialize it for them, whether it's like writing a letter to that person or writing a letter to themselves, but finding ways to just memorialize that loss. Can anybody else think of anything else? Oh, I have to see I have a chat. Yes, Allie, being patient and taking care of your own health. Patient, I couldn't emphasize enough, because being patient is like we were talking about earlier, grief is not just subjected to like a times like a certain time space, or like, you know, it has to be done with a certain time. It takes a degree of patience with ourselves, and by taking care of ourselves. Anyone else have anything they can think of that could possibly help, like when feeling grief or when grieving, either from personal experience or what you've seen others do? Okay. I saw a chat pop through there. Yeah, being around people who actually care about you. That's a good one, Allie. Actually, I'm going to go to this next slide then, because I think that is actually a perfect segue into this one. Because not only do we experience grief, but our friends who are grieving. And so I put down a few tips for how to help whenever you notice that a friend is grieving. And you know, there are ways in which you guys know your friends, like, you know, when they're not okay, you know, when it seems like they're not themselves. And guys, like, there's nothing wrong with reaching out and asking about it, like asking, hey, are you okay? I have never had anyone get mad at me about just simply checking in on them. Even if they aren't ready to talk. You know, that's a big thing about grief. Sometimes people are just not ready to talk about it, but just simply asking like, hey, are you okay? I think goes above and beyond. But what I put down here for tips for friends who are grieving: one, put down the toolbox as for grief. And what that means by that is like kind of like how I told, you know, when you guys go to talk to someone about grief, like obviously I hope that you remember some of the things that we talk about, but I never want you to be like, okay, what did Nathan say? Like, what's the exact script that I need to say right here? It's not about being scripted. It's about being authentic. It's about being like exactly like Ali was saying, about actually caring, putting down the toolbox and just simply allowing yourself to be present with someone. And also too, guys, like we live in a society where like our phones are constantly I mean, we're encouraged to be on screens, you know, it's like a necessity now. But there's something about like just simply putting your phone on silent, and just simply putting it off to the side and allowing yourself to be present with that person. So I would add that, put down your toolbox, like trying to fix someone, and also put down your phone. simply show up and be normal. It's okay to I think I'm naturally an awkward person in general, and so I think my normal is my awkward. And so, but it's okay to feel awkward. But when you show up, just be yourself with them, have the same, you can talk about the same jokes, talk about the same movies, listen to them. And like I said about with the phone, being authentically present with them by making eye contact, or if you don't want to make eye contact, simply just listen to them while they talk. Some of my best conversations have been over Uno games, with my teens, and we don't have to be looking straight in the eye, but people just start talking, as we're engaged in a game. I put don't grief rank, and what I mean by that is we do this a lot as people, or some other people do this, is that they're really quick to be well, let's say someone lost a job. Well, at least your wife didn't lose her job, or my wife lost her, no, sorry, my mom when she lost her cat. Well, at least you all didn't lose your other cats. At least you still have 3 more. Or we do that, a lot of this at least type of thing, where we try to compare griefs to other griefs, and there's no comparison. And I think it's normal as humans. I think we want to do that with ourselves. Well, at least I didn't lose this, or at least I didn't lose that. But pain is authentic pain. When you feel pain, when you feel grief, that is your own experience. And I find that doing that grief ranking doesn't really help. It just invalidates what the other person or what yourself is experiencing. And then I find creative ways to help them. And so that can mean simply sending over you can buy Chick-fil-A for them. You could help do some chores for them around the house. And they may not want that. They may just want you could buy them for some V-Bucks from Fortnite that I know some of you guys really like to play. It's just simply showing up and being that helping presence. And then let me go over to the next slide. And then I just want to say too, it is okay to seek extra help. And what that means is I have teenagers who come to me for grief work. I have teenagers who come to me for a variety of reasons, and it's okay. It's okay to talk with someone, whether it's a therapist or whether it's a school counselor or a teacher or a coach. It's okay to get extra help, or even going and talking with your parents. You guys are in that stage of, development, not to get all psychology-y on you, but you're in that beautiful stage of development where you're figuring out who you are as a person. Teenagers, you guys are there's just this natural pull that happens as you guys become more independent. But it's okay, in the midst of your independence and you're figuring out who you are, to also seek help if you need it, because that doesn't mean that you're less of a person, or it doesn't mean that your friend is less of a person. It just means that you're human and that you're grieving. And then I wanted to give you guys just some resources to have for you all. I don't know how to really pronounce that. It's Dougie, I think, .org. But if you guys wanted to do your extra research on grief, you found this topic interesting, please look at Dougie. They have a ton of other resources. They have some scripts on how to talk to people who are grieving. They have, a lot of the tips I pulled from Dougie, as well as my own experience. I did want to put the suicide support hotline down there and the text hotline down there for you guys, because I give that in each of my presentations, just to have on file in case you happen to notice a friend who is talking about death or dying, or you're really concerned about. I just really wanted you guys to have those resources. And then I also wanted to have space for you guys to have any questions too. I know I looked down at the clock while we were talking and I realized it's 7:40, and I was like, how did we get this late? You guys have been such a beautiful audience, but I wanted to make sure especially that we have time today for anyone who wants to ask a question in the chat bar, or if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, I'd be happy to do my best to answer. Any questions at all, and no questions are wrong question. If there's anything you feel like I wasn't clear about either, feel free to ask. Actually, if anyone's raising their hand, I don't know how you tell who raises hands on here. Sandy, you're much more proficient at this than I am.
I don't see any hands
Okay,
yet.
beautiful.
I was wondering if you could, well, you stopped screen sharing, which is fine. Maybe you could put it in the chat, or if you can go
Yeah.
back to the screen with the phone
Yeah.
number or the hotline number on it.
Oh, yes, for sure.
And then if they want to maybe jot that down, I would
Yes.
highly recommend you guys to jot those down, because they could be very important resources for you in a time. I mean, you might not ever expect to use them, and hopefully you won't need to, but if you do, you'll have those. So if you have a phone, or if you have a planner, or you have something that's with you fairly often, stick those things in there.
Yeah, that's perfect. I'll leave that on there for sure.
Thank you. I know that one of my kids came home one day from school and shared that she had a friend that had made comments. And I was like, we need to talk to more people about that. That, it's not something that you joke about. And you never know if the person is joking or not, or if they're serious. Because in Allie's point, some people joke around to cover up their hurt or their pain. So.
Exactly. No, I think, if I could encourage you guys, like, just keep those numbers on hand to give to someone, especially the text line too. If you're going to pick one, I'd even say the text line, because some people don't even feel comfortable talking on the phone. I think both of these are just so vital to have. Allie, I see that you asked a question, like, what's the best way to know if you are grieving and how to get help? That's actually a really a beautiful question to ask. Like, I think that's a really important question. I would say, like, if you feel like things just, something feels different, like it feels like something's just not quite right. Like, I would honestly say, like, if what you're feeling is grief, or you feel like you don't know how to put a name on it, I would find someone who you trust, who is safe first. Like, I think, like I said, as humans, like, I think relationships are, that's a lot of times those are things that we grieve, but I think relationships are also how we heal as well. So I would say find someone who you consider to be safe, who you can kind of talk it out about, maybe what you're feeling. Honestly, if I had a client who said, I don't know if what I'm feeling is grief, like, when people have asked me that, like, if they said, like, I don't know if that's actually grief or not, usually, like, this is like a statistic from Nathan Land, like, not from any research, but like 9 times out of 10, like, it's actually, it is because they're grieving. So I think even just simply asking that question, is like, is what I'm feeling grief, is probably a pretty clear indicator. But yeah, I mean, other things, like I said before, if you happen to notice yourself just not functioning the way that you were before a loss, and like I said, some losses are hard to define. But then, getting help, like, I would say first starting, like, with people who you consider safe, like your parents, or your school officials, if those people feel safe. If you don't feel like there's anyone in your life you can really talk to about this, these numbers I put are really excellent numbers. And if you're trying to put words to grief, like, I would even say, like, going on and looking at Dougie, because they really kind of talk, they talk in such really, like, really humanistic language. Like, they're very non-pathologizing. They don't make it feel like a problem. They just kind of lay out, like, what grief is. And so I would say, if you want to do your own research on, in addition to that, Dougie is a good one to go to. Any other questions anyone can think of? What would you recommend to do to handle if people in your life are trying to tell you you have grieved long enough? Oh gosh, that's a good and hard question. I've been in that situation before, not necessarily me personally, but, like, I have even been, like, when I've seen loved ones, like, we've gone and we've been with people who have experienced loss, and, like, and I've heard a lot of times, like, well, at least they're in the better place now. And like, I always, Sandy, for me personally, I try to always assume that people are meaning their best, that they have the best intentions. And I think, they're truly wanting to try to help, but they don't know. And so, I would say, like, if a person in your life is telling you that you're not grieving enough, like, I mean, this is kind of coming to a matter of safety. Those might not be people who you talk about your grief with, you know, if you feel like, you know, they're not giving you space and able to be able to help it. If you feel like people are truly wanting to be there, and I think a grieving person, like, I think it's each of our responsibilities to educate ourselves, but I think like a grieving person, like, just gently, like, I think it's okay to tell people sometimes, like, well, you know, I've been feeling sad lately, and I've been feeling, I've been grieving lately, and I've actually been thinking about this a lot lately, and that's okay. Like, it's okay to not be okay. But I find, for me personally, the top tip I could say to handle that one is just to keep in my mind that people typically, I always just try to assume the best in people, and that helps me live like a life I want to live. If you and a close friend is grieving, do you help them or help yourself first? That's a really good question too, Allie. You know, in counseling school, we were given the metaphor about, like, you know, the air masks that fall out from the plane, and they talk about self-care, like, you know, like, help yourself and then you can focus on helping other people. And so this is a pretty nuanced question, like, you know, and so I think I think it would depend on the situation. But I would say, like, you know, what does helping look like? You know, because people can grieve together, like, as far as relationships go. But if you're feeling like you don't have space in that relationship to grieve, like if their grief is so overwhelming, then I would say yes. And what does it look like for me to be able to take care of myself before I can try to take care of them? Because sometimes, like, you know, when we don't take care of ourselves, and this is kind of coming to like a regular, like, you know, this is what I talk about, strategies to help with the grief waves. But when we don't take care of ourselves, like, you know, we're trying to put emotions off to the side, or we're not being attuned to ourselves, and we can easily, like, sometimes we can say things we don't mean, or we can be hurtful, and sometimes we actually sometimes can do more damage, even unintentionally. But like, we can find that sometimes we can say those things which, you know, we don't want other people to say to us, like, well, at least this didn't happen, or, you know, at least they're in a better place, or, you know, so I think generally, as a rule, I think, you know, it would take a specific, I mean, looking at the situation, but as a rule, I say, like, you know, first attend to your own grief, what that looks like, whether it's in context of a relationship or just needing some time to yourself, because that's okay too. And then, like, you know, looking to see what does it mean to help my friend who is grieving as well. That's an excellent question. All right, if anyone else, anything else? Okay, I
And
think we may be good.
yeah, if anybody thinks of a question afterwards they wished that they had thought of while they were on here with you, would it be okay for them to send them to me and me get them over to you to answer?
Oh, I would love that. I would love that. And feel free, if anyone, I didn't put my email address in here, but I'm going to put it in the chat. So yes, if you want to message Sandy, or you can email me directly, feel free to email me, guys, if you all have any more questions. I know sometimes, like, you don't want to ask a question in a public setting. I got to tell you guys, you all have been so awesome to present to. Like, it's been one of my favorite avenues and groups to present with, because believe it or not, when I practiced this, like, I didn't know how long this was going to take. I was like, oh dang, when I talked it through, it's like 25 minutes. And then you guys have made this somewhat like such an enjoyable conversation. So I'm grateful. So yeah, feel free to send me an email if you guys feel comfortable.
Awesome. And this has been very amazing. A lot of great information. And they definitely interacted more than, even though it was through chat, so it was kind of quiet, but it was still interacting. And I greatly appreciate the interaction that you guys did, the participation that you had tonight. Thank you so much for that. And Nathan, thank you so much for your time and for sharing with us tonight. It was wonderful.
Thank you so much. Thank you guys for having me. I hope you all have a good night and a good rest of your week.
You as well. Good night, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Good night.